Welcome back to Hardware Unboxed. Today we are taking a look at the more entry-level AMD B650 motherboards, priced up to around $220 US. And yeah, I know that's not a price point that we typically deem as entry-level, but the reality is that's about where the majority of the most affordable B650 motherboards are priced. The question is, for those of you wanting to jump on the AM5 platform while spending as little as possible on the motherboard, which boards are the best? Well, to answer that, I'll be torture testing 11 boards using the Ryzen 9 7950X, looking at VRM thermal performance, all-core performance, gaming performance, and boot times. But before we get into the data, let's quickly take a look at each board individually. Starting with the MSI Pro B650M-A WiFi at $200, this can be considered a mid-tier board for this roundup. In terms of features, it is well equipped for a micro ATX motherboard, though I have to say, there's nothing particularly noteworthy about it. There's no PCIe 5.0 support to speak of. You get the standard 2 M.2 slots and 3 PCIe expansion slots. It does include 11 USB 3.2 ports, so that's nice, and you also get Wi-Fi 6E and 2.5 gigabit LAN. There's basic Realtek ALC 897 audio, and the I/O panel is fairly basic, I'd say. 8 USB ports in total, no Type-C. There's the basic audio and network connections along with a DisplayPort and HDMI output. Oh, and there's also a BIOS flashback button. As for the VRM V-core, it's powered by 8 Alpha and Omega 55 amp power stages, teamed in pairs for a 4-phase configuration. Then cooling them is a pair of large black aluminium heatsinks, though they're not connected, so they're just individual heatsinks, no heat pipes here at all. Overall, it is a solid looking motherboard, certainly underwhelming for $200, but that's the state of DDR5 motherboards at this point, especially those supporting the AM5 platform. Then for an extra $20, so $220 US, there's an ATX version called the Pro B650-P WiFi, though at the time of filming, it is on sale for $200 US, so that's probably a pretty good price for that board. In short though, this is simply a stretched out version of the Pro B650M-A, though design-wise they do look very similar. This ATX model has been upgraded with 75 amp Renesas power stages, and in total there's a dozen for a 12-phase V-core. So that's a significant and impressive upgrade that's probably worth the extra $20 alone, but if not, you also get an additional PCIe slot and a Type-C USB on the I/O panel. In terms of VRM cooling, the P is similar to the A, which is fine as the upgraded VRM isn't going to be all that demanding on the cooling. So at the $200 US sale price, this looks to be a great board, but at $220, it does face some pretty steep competition that we're going to look at in a moment. Moving on to Asrock, we have the B650 MPG Riptide Wi-Fi at $180 US, making it one of the most affordable AM5 motherboards. For the money, it appears very well equipped though. Firstly, Asrock has squeezed 4 PCI expansion slots onto this micro ATX board, along with 2 M.2 slots, and impressively, one of those M.2s supports PCIe 5.0, a feature that was completely missing from both MSI boards. Around at the I/O panel, there's 8 USB ports in total, one of which is a Type-C. You also get 2.5 gigabit LAN, Wi-Fi 6E, HDMI, and a DisplayPort output, along with a BIOS flashback button. In total, the board supports 9 USB 3.2 ports and 8 USB 2.0 ports, so there's plenty of USB support on offer here. The VRM also looks good. Here we have a dozen 50 amp power stages covered by a massive aluminium heatsink. The primary M.2 slot also comes with a relatively large heatsink. Overall, it is a very nice looking board and on paper appears more impressive than the more expensive MSI Pro B650M-A WiFi. Asrock also offers the B650 PG Lightning for $200, and this is basically an ATX version of the Riptide featuring a number of upgrades, though it does lack Wi-Fi support. But as this is a larger ATX board, you get a better PCIe layout, an additional M.2 slot, so 3 in total, with the primary still supporting PCIe 5.0. The USB 3.2 support has increased to 11 ports, up from 9. There are 12 ports on the I/O panel, 4 of which are USB 2.0, but there's also a Type-C included. The next big upgrade has been made to the VRM. You're getting 14 60 amp power stages, so this board should run very cool, even with the 7950X. Asrock's also included some large VRM heatsinks and a large heatsink for the primary M.2 slot. So overall, this is another solid looking B650 motherboard for around $200 US. Then, the third Asrock motherboard to be included in this roundup is the B650 Pro RS, coming in at $220 US. When compared to the Lightning, the Pro RS features an even larger VRM heatsink, with higher quality thermal pads on the same 14 60 amp power stage V-core. The M.2 port configuration remains the same, so the primary port features a heat spreader and supports PCIe 5.0, while one of the other two is limited to PCIe 4.0 and then the other PCIe 3.0. Oddly though, the USB support has been cut down with just 7 USB 3.2 ports in total, 4 of which can be found in the I/O panel, along with half a dozen of the older USB 2.0 ports. The only real upgrade has been made to the PCIe configuration, which sees the primary and secondary PCIe ports connected to the CPU, but they're still only PCIe 4.0, so it's not really a massive upgrade. We're also looking at basic Realtek ALC 897 audio, no Wi-Fi, and 2.5 gigabit LAN, so based on that, the Lightning does look to be the better deal of these two Asrock motherboards. Okay, time for the Asus boards, and the cheapest model I could find is the Prime B650M-A WiFi for $180 US, but Asus didn't want to sample this board, instead sending the Prime B650M-A WiFi 2. I'm not really sure what the deal is with the second version, nor do I know how much it costs, as it is yet to go on sale in the US or here in Australia, at least at the time of making this video. Therefore, to cover my bases, I purchased the original version, so now I have both. The Prime B650M-A WiFi is a very unimpressive looking motherboard, I have to say, especially at $180 US, featuring a single small VRM heatsink and no pre-installed I/O cover. The primary M.2 port does support PCIe 5.0 with a secondary PCIe 4.0 port, so that's pretty nice. There's half a dozen USB 3.2 ports in total with 8 USB 2.0 ports. You get Wi-Fi 6E and 2.5 gigabit LAN, but with just 4 USB 3.2 ports on the I/O panel, with another 4 USB 2.0 ports, it's a pretty weak offering. But worst of all, by far, is the vCore VRM, or just the VRM in general. The vCore portion is 4 phases, using doubled up onsemi 4C10N and 4C06N MOSFETs per phase, so no power stages here, just discrete MOSFETs. And these discrete MOSFETs coupled with the tiny heatsinks are surely going to lead to some very underwhelming thermal results. Then we have the board that Asus sent, the Asus Prime B650M-A WiFi 2. And as far as I can tell, this is the same motherboard as the original, but with a much larger VRM heatsink. Now, although Asus provided this board about 2 months ago now, it still doesn't seem to be on sale, so I don't know how much it costs. I also don't know why Asus made it, and why you can't buy it yet. But for now, it does appear to be the VRM Benchmark Edition board, though I'm not sure the heatsink is going to make that much of a difference for such a weak VRM on a $200-ish motherboard. Asus also has the Prime B650 Plus at $200 US, and this is another B650 motherboard they didn't want to send over for testing, so we also purchased this one. This is basically an ATX version of the Dash A, so there's still no pre-installed I/O shield, a relatively small VRM heatsink, a more limited supply of USB ports when compared to competing boards, and worst of all, we're still getting crappy discrete MOSFETs from Vishay this time, so a super unimpressive entry-level lineup here from Asus. Now lastly, we have 3 motherboards from Gigabyte, and the cheapest of which is the B650M DS3H, which can currently be had for just $155 US, which admittedly still quite a bit of money for entry-level motherboard, but as far as AM5 motherboards go, this thing is dirt cheap and by far the cheapest B650 motherboard. Despite that though, it is quite a good looking board that includes large VRM heatsinks and a large M.2 heat spreader that covers the primary and secondary M.2 slots. In total, there's 2 PCI expansion slots, 2 M.2 slots, 7 USB 3.2 ports, and 8 USB 2.0 ports, along with 2.5 gigabit LAN. The I/O panel, which doesn't include a pre-installed shield, only features 4 USB 3.2 ports, but one is a Type-C, and then there's an additional 4 USB 2.0 ports, so a similar configuration to many of the $200 to $220-ish boards that we've already looked at. The DS3H also packs a decent VRM with half a dozen 60-amp power stages making up the vCore, so this $155 US board should destroy those Asus models that we just looked at. Overall, an exciting offering here from Gigabyte, especially given the price. I can't wait to see what this thing can do. Next up, we have the B650M Gaming X AX, which costs quite a bit more than the DS3H at $200 US, and for the most part, it's really the same motherboard. It includes the same VRM, so half a dozen 60-amp power stages for the vCore. The M.2 and PCIe configuration is the same. The I/O panel is identical, with the exception of Wi-Fi 6E, which has been added to this board, along with a pre-installed I/O shield. But other than that, they're pretty much the same motherboard, so I struggle to understand why you'd spend roughly 30% more on the Gaming X-AX over the DS3H. Then for $220, we have the ATX version of the Gaming X-AX, though this board is quite a bit nicer. The VRM heatsinks have been upgraded. There's an extra M.2 slot, taking the total of 3, and all of them include heat spreaders, which is a nice touch. There's also an additional PCIe slot and an extra USB 3.2 port. Also worth noting that there's an additional 2 USB 3.2 ports in the I/O panel, but other than that, it is very similar configuration to the M-ATX version and of course the DS3H. The VRM though has been upgraded with an additional 2 power stages, taking the total to 8 60 amp power stages. So it is certainly a nice upgrade from the DS3H in that sense, and a better board than the M-ATX version. But again, at $200, it's a lot more expensive than the DS3H, and you aren't exactly getting a lot more for that extra 40% investment. Okay, so now that we've taken a quick look at each of these boards individually, it's time to get testing. And rather than just show you the thermal results, which we typically do for VRM thermal testing, I've got some more traditional benchmarks as well, because performance between these various boards does differ, probably more than you'd expect, and we'll get to that shortly. For testing, I'm using the Gigabyte Aorus C500 glass case with the Gigabyte UD1000GM power supply, and for cooling the Gigabyte Aorus Waterforce X 360mm AIO. Gigabyte were also kind enough to send over their Aorus Gen 4 AIC SSD 2TB model, and this did save me quite a lot of time as I didn't have to remove M.2 covers to install drives. Oh, and for the memory, they also sent over a kit of their 32GB Aorus RGB DDR5 6000 memory. So again, big thank you to Gigabyte for helping us out with this test system. Now for recording temperatures, I'm using a digital thermometer with K-type thermocouples, and I'm reporting the peak rear PCB temperature. Finally, I'm not reporting delta T over ambient, instead I maintain a room temperature of 21 degrees, and to ensure a constant ambient temperature, a thermocouple is positioned next to the test system. As for the stress test, I'm using the Ryzen 9 7950X CPU, and then for applying load, Cinebench R23, which was looped for an hour, at which point I'm reporting the maximum PCB temperature, again recorded using K-type thermocouples. Okay, so here's the VRM thermal results, and we have quite a bit to go over. Firstly, all of the results selected in red are a fail, or a technical fail, let's say. The Asrock Riptide, for example, comes out of the box with a 75-degree thermal limit for the CPU, which is effectively a power limit, so although I've included this result, it's technically not valid, as the 7950X was being power limited. The good news though is you can quickly remove this limit in the BIOS, allowing the 7950X to hit the standard TJ max of 95 degrees, and when doing so, the Riptide VRM hits 76 degrees, which is still a very acceptable result. In fact, it's a very good result, so I have no idea why Asrock is power limiting this board out of the box. They absolutely don't need to be. It appears to be a very capable motherboard. Now, the Asus Prime 2, which I've dubbed the Benchmark Edition, is proving to be just that, with heavy power limits out of the box to ensure the board doesn't hit 100 degrees like the original version, which peaked at 104 degrees. Now, the Prime B650M-A WiFi and Prime B650-Plus technically passed our stress tests as the CPU didn't throttle, but the rear side of the PCB did exceed 100 degrees under optimal conditions, meaning that the actual VRM components were at least 10 degrees hotter than that. So while they technically worked, at over 100 degrees, we deem that to be a failure, as you wouldn't want to run these components at such high temperatures for extended periods of time, and you wouldn't want to do so in a warmer climate because, well, they would run even hotter than what we're showing here and what we consider to be a very optimal configuration in a well-ventilated case in a 21-degree room. But in any case, regardless of where you land on that, with similar priced boards running at below 80 degrees, clearly these Asus boards are a fail. The Asrock B650 Pro RS produced the best result, peaking at just 58 degrees, which is fairly unsurprising given it packs 14 60-amp power stages. Still, we're not looking for the absolute best result here. I do need to stress that, or even the best results. Rather, we're just interested in acceptable results. So anything under 80 degrees is very manageable and will work well under basically all conditions. So that means that almost all of the B650 boards we've tested here do tick that box, including the cheapest model, the Gigabyte B650M DS3H. The CPU frequency did dip a little bit on the DS3H, but we're only talking about a 2% reduction when compared to the highest clocked models. Now here's a look at how each board performed after a 10-minute loop. None of these results are particularly shocking, and even the power limited out-of-the-box configurations for a board like the Riptide saw it trail the fastest board by a mere 5% margin. Perhaps the bigger issue though, and it's one that saw me reinstall some of these boards several times, is memory support. Now, the purpose of this content was to primarily test VRM Thermals, but I ended up spending about 3 times longer messing around with memory issues. Initially, I only got the Gigabyte boards stable with DDR5 6000. MSI eventually sorted out their stability issues with DDR5 6000 CL30 memory, and they did release a new BIOS revision that addressed those issues. At least they did to me. I believe publicly that BIOS will be available soon. The Asrock boards were a bit hit and miss when it came to memory compatibility. Oddly, the Riptide was good at DDR5 6000 using the CL30 stuff, but the Lightning and Pro RS both failed, forcing me to run at 5600. Now, the Lightning and Pro RS were both tested with BIOS version 1.11.AS03, which was the latest version available at the time of testing. The Riptide, though, that has 2 more BIOS updates, and the latest of which is 1.14.AS15, and that worked just fine with the DDR5 6000 CL30 memory. So presumably Asrock will eventually provide that updated BIOS revision for the rest of their B650 lineup, and that will solve the memory issues. AMD has also confirmed that Asus have solved their DDR5 issues, and that these 3 models tested here will be receiving an update soon. But of course we do need to test that and validate for ourselves rather than just take their word for it. For now though, DDR5 5600 is the highest stable memory speed that we could achieve on these more entry-level Asus B650 motherboards. Now just quickly, before we move on to the gaming benchmarks, here's a look at the Cinebench R23 Single core results. Power limits shouldn't really affect this data, but we're still seeing a 4% performance variation between the fastest and slowest boards, though for the most part the margins are within 2%. Now before we jump into the gaming benchmarks, let's quickly skim over the DDR5 memory timings that are applied by each motherboard. Some of these timings are determined by the G-Skill Trident Z5 Neo memory, while others are left up to the motherboard to configure, so there are a number of secondary timings that will vary from one board to another. To date, I have to say, Gigabyte has been the most aggressive when it comes to these timings, and without any stability concerns, at least on our end, I think it's fair to say they've done the best job. So let's see how that translates into gaming performance. Here we see, depending on the memory timings used and the memory frequency, there can be up to a 9% performance discrepancy between boards. The most dialed in boards come from MSI and Gigabyte, though you have to give Gigabyte credit for nailing memory support from the get-go. MSI has only just recently caught up here, and initially we couldn't get their boards stable past DDR5 5600, so that was very disappointing. So if you own one of these MSI B650 motherboards and are planning on purchasing one, make sure you do update to the latest BIOS, which again at the time of putting this together isn't publicly available yet, but should be soon. As for the Asrock and Asus boards, they're around 7 to 8% slower than the MSI and Gigabyte models, so that's a bit disappointing, and both companies have some BIOS work ahead of them. Now the results scaled a little differently in Watch Dogs Legion, though you can see a clear trend where the MSI and Gigabyte boards are clearly faster, but the Riptide and its DDR5 6000 memory support is right there this time. Now something a lot of you have asked me to test is boot times, so I made sure to do that here. What you're looking at here is the time it took to hit the Windows desktop from the time I pressed the power button, and the results are based on a 3-run average, each time starting the system from a completely powered off state. The results are quite surprising. Typically I'd expect a DDR5 system to be fairly slow, as we've already seen this with Intel, but Gigabyte has found a way to load into Windows in well under 30 seconds from the time you hit the power button. All 3 models achieved a blistering fast 23 seconds. The next best was the Asrock Pro RS, which took 37 seconds, around 60% longer than the Gigabyte boards. Then we have the Asrock PG Lightning, that was slower again at 40 seconds, and then the PG Riptide, along with the Asus boards, which took 43 seconds. But all of those boards seemed fast compared to the 53 seconds MSI took. And we saw the same sluggish load times of both the 162 and 163 BIOS revisions. So this is something MSI will have to work on, and it is a disappointing result, especially when compared to the Gigabyte boards, which were more than twice as fast to boot up. So there you have it, a full rundown of the more affordable AMD B650 motherboards. Now to pick a few winners. Without a doubt, the best value offering here is the Gigabyte B650M-DS3H. It is a little ripper, that one. At $155 US, there is simply nothing that can compete with it. There's nothing even close to it in price. That said, here in Australia, it is just $10 more affordable than the Asrock PG Riptide. So depending on what you're after or perhaps what region you live in, either one of these boards could be the better deal. The PG Riptide packs a more substantial VRM, though thermals were much the same. A PCI 5.0 enabled M.2 slot, more USB 3.2 ports, and Wi-Fi 6E. The disadvantages include the longer boot times, which may or may not affect you, and generally slower gaming performance due to more relaxed secondary memory timings. Both boards are very good options though, so it will come down to pricing in your region, and over in the US, the DS3H looks to be a no-brainer. So if you're after an ATX board, the Asrock PG Lightning is a nice option, as are the slightly more expensive MSI Pro B650-P WiFi and Gigabyte B650 Gaming X AX boards. Again, it'll come down to pricing in your region, but the Gaming X would be my first choice, mostly because these boards are quite similar in terms of features, but the Gigabyte board just feels more dialed in. Faster boot times and generally better gaming performance would steer me in that direction. Really, the only B650 motherboards that I'd avoid, now and in the future, regardless of any BIOS updates, is sadly all three Asus models. They're just not very good. Using discrete MOSFETs, even on their $200 US prime B650-Plus was a terrible move, especially when competing boards are packing up to 14 power stages. There's really nothing Asus can do about these boards now. The VRMs suck, but even that aside, they still have plenty of work to do if they wish to match the likes of Gigabyte. Memory support's a mess, performance is a mess, the boot times are slow, admittedly not MSI slow, but they're still a weakness of the Asus models. Anyway, as I said, even if Asus were to address all of those issues, there's still the VRM problem, which they can't fix without releasing an entirely new motherboard. So it's a shame to see them fall flat here, and I'm hoping the next tier up from them will have some better boards on offer, and that's something I plan to look at soon. For now, those of you looking at buying one of the more affordable B650 motherboards should have a pretty good idea of where to start, and I certainly hope this video was helpful because it did take weeks of testing, countless rebuilds of test systems, trying different BIOSes, and yeah, it started off as quite a mess, but I think we've got to a good place now. MSI should have new BIOSes that will be publicly available, possibly by the time this video is live, hopefully not too soon after if that's not the case, but does improve memory support. I've been told that Asus, where their boards are all here, also new BIOS updates on the way that'll improve memory compatibility with probably the whole Asus B650 range. So good news if that is the case, which I've been told it will be. Anyway, that's it. If you like the video, please hit the like button. You can support work like this and all the other stuff we do here at Hardware Unboxed via our Patreon and Floatplane accounts. So sign up to either one of those, get access to our exclusive Discord server for members only, monthly live stream to myself get together and do that, behind the scenes content, Q&As, a lot of cool stuff there. So yeah, check it out if you're interested. But if not, that is perfectly fine. And I would like to thank you for watching this video. I'm your host, Steve. See you again next time.